Content note. The romance of a rogue contains unhealthy relationship dynamics and the romanticization of stalking. Listen at your own risk. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I'm excited to read to you from The Romance of a Rogue by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 4. Bruce Lowry walked as far as the Marble Arch, then took a bus down to Chancery Lane. He was conscious of great excitement and eagerness, emotions which he had not experienced for years. The sun was shining, and there was the wonderful promise of spring in the air. He could feel the pulse leaping in his body as he sat leaning a little forward, watching the busy street with the interest of a schoolboy who visits London for the first time. And all the while his brain was working busily. He must work. That was the first thing. He must make money. Without money, nothing of all that he meant to do was possible. When the bus stopped at the corner of Chancery Lane, he got down and walked slowly along, looking up at the buildings on his left with eager eyes. It had been here, he was sure, that Smithers had lived. Good old Smithers, who had done his best for him during those last terrible days. There it was, the same small brass plate and dark doorway. The rogue's heart began to beat fast as he entered it and began to climb the winding stairs. What kind of a reception awaited him here? On the first floor landing he stood still for a moment, afraid to go on. Then he squared his shoulders and opened the door immediately facing him. An office boy came forward. "Mr. Smithers in?" The boy eyed him impartially. "Yes, sir. What name, if you please, sir?" "Lowry. Bruce Lowry." The color deepened in his face as he saw the flash of interest in the boy's eyes. So Edward had told Smithers of their meeting yesterday, and he was expected. "Will you come this way, sir?" A moment later, and he was in Mr. Smithers's private office, and the lawyer had risen from his chair to greet him. There was a little silence. Then the rogue said, "Edward told you I was out, of course." "Yes." Bruce Lowry looked round the room, surprised to find how faithfully he remembered it, even down to the piled-up, dusty boxes on the shelves and a starred crack on the top window pane behind Mr. Smithers's chair. He ran a nervous finger round the inside of his collar. "You used to have the desk the other way about, didn't you?" he said irrelevantly. Mr. Smithers laughed with a touch of deep emotion. Then he held out his hand. "We are not all like your brother, my boy," he said. The rogue stared, the blood rushing in a painful flood to his forehead. Then he took a blind step forward, and their hands met. The rogue broke off in his stammered attempt to defend himself, and turned away. Mr. Smithers blew his nose violently. "There's a cold wind today, a very cold wind," he said. "Sit down, and I'll stir up the fire. Wait a moment." He went to the door and spoke to the office boy, who was evidently lingering close at hand. "I'm not into anyone until I ring," he said. "You understand?" Then he came back and shut the door. "Now then, we shall be undisturbed," he said cheerily. He stooped and tipped some more coal onto the fire. "Sit down, my boy, and tell me all about yourself. Where are you living? What are you going to do?" Lowry shook his head. He had thought himself impregnable to all emotion, and yet half a dozen times already since he came back to the world he had suffered almost unbearably. I only came out yesterday. I saw Edward. He wouldn't have anything to do with me, of course, at least. He offered me a passage to the colonies, which I refused." He raised defiant eyes to the old man's face. "Why should I be hounded out of the country? I can make good. I know I can if they give me a chance. He broke off, and for a moment hid his face in his hands. It was not for himself now that he cared, but for the sake of a tragic, unhappy woman, who last night had looked at him with the eyes of Charmian. Mr. Smithers cleared his throat. "Where did you stay last night?" he asked, after a moment. Bruce looked up. "An old musician named Christopher took me home with him," he said huskily. "I met him in a public house. He knew I was a jailbird, but he didn't care. He's been damned good." "Why didn't you come to me?" "To you?" Bruce laughed. "I'd already received one rebuff from Edward." "I see. You thought I was the same. What made you come today, then?" "To ask if you can suggest something for me to do. I've got to work. I've got to live and make money. You know I haven't a red cent, of course, and even if Edward would help me, I'd rather starve than let him. I'm strong. I'll do anything. I had to, where I've come from. He spread out his hands. Work-roughened they were, but with long, sensitive fingers. "I'll do anything, anything," he said again, eagerly. Mr. Smithers was watching him with sympathetic eyes. "We'll talk about that presently," he promised. "In the meantime, tell me, who have you seen since yesterday?" "Only my sainted brother." Mr. Smithers looked away from him. "Have you heard from anyone during the last 6 years?" The rogue shook his head. "Who did you think would be likely to write to me?" he asked, roughly. "Unless you imagine that Hardingham," he broke off, a little gleam in his eyes. "Do you know where Hardingham is?" Mr. Smithers spread his hands in swift denial. Good Lord, no! I lost sight of the scoundrel years ago. He got married. Did you know that?" "No. Is it likely I could know?" "Well, he married. I believe he left England soon afterwards, but I never actually heard. And you may be sure I was not interested enough to make inquiries." Bruce Lowry laughed harshly. "God help his wife," he said. "Yes," Mr. Smithers agreed. "She would need all the help she could get from the Almighty, poor soul." There was a little silence. Then he said briskly, "You said just now that you must have money." "Yes." There was a little smile in Mr. Smithers' eyes. "Do you remember the Silver Heel mines, Bruce?" The rogue nodded. "They were one of my dud speculations." "Why?" "We all looked upon them as worthless 6 years ago," Mr. Smithers said quietly. "And so they were, and are, for their original purpose. But 4 years since, they struck a vein of gold on the estate, accidentally, and subsequent experiments. Steady, boy, steady!" Bruce had started up, his face crimson, his breath coming fast. Well, he said hoarsely. Mr. Smithers rose too, his eyes very kind. "I am glad to say that your shares, which, if you remember, we did not think worth troubling about when, 6 years ago, you needed money, will make you, if not a rich man, at least independent of your brother or anyone else for the rest of your life." The rogue strode forward and gripped the old man by both shoulders. It's true? You're not just saying it? It's true?" "On my word of honor, and nobody is more pleased than I am." The rogue groped backwards and fell into his chair again. Thank God, he said, but it was not of himself that he thought, but of Charmian. Mr. Smithers walked to the window and stood looking into the busy street. He had always liked Bruce Lowry and pitied him, and his eyes were a little misty now as he stared at the passing traffic and wondered what the future held in store for this man with his ruined life. It seemed a long time before either of them spoke. Then Bruce said rather shamefacedly, "I'm all right now, but it was a bit of shock. You see, I'd made up my mind to the worst possible, and what you said just at first, it knocked all the stuffing out of me." His voice was quick and excited, and his face was still very flushed when Mr. Smithers turned round and looked at him again. "You see, it's like coming back from the dead," he went on. "Last night I felt utterly down and out. If it hadn't been for old John Christopher, I don't know what on earth I should have done. He's one of the best. I'd like you to know him. I tell you, a man appreciates kindness when he's in my position." He rose and began walking about the room excitedly. Mr. Smithers watched him with quiet eyes. 6 years had changed him greatly, he thought. They had turned an irresponsible, carefree youth into a man very near middle age, with lines in his face and much gray in his cropped hair. And yet, in some way which was indefinable, Mr. Smithers thought he could see improvement too, a greater manliness, a greater strength, even though with it was also a greater hardness. Bruce went on talking excitedly. "I can breathe again now. I know I was let out of jail yesterday, but I never really felt free until you told me this. I can make something of my life after all, try and undo the wrong I've done to others." Mr. Smithers cut in sharply. "To others?" The rogue checked his agitated pacing, and for a moment did not answer. Then he said very quietly, "Mr. Smithers, do you know what became of Charmian Lee?" Mr. Smithers turned away. He had been expecting this question and dreading it. "No, I do not know," he answered firmly. "You never saw her afterwards?" Mr. Smithers shook his head. "No, at least, she came here once, to this office." "She came here?" Bruce looked swiftly round the room, almost as if he expected to see the joyous ghost of the girl he had known 6 years ago. Why did she come here? He asked. Mr. Smithers faced him with an effort. Am I to answer that question? Please. The elder man went to a drawer in his desk, unlocked it, and drew out a small box tied with pink tape. She brought these, he said reluctantly. She said she did not know what else to do with them. He pushed the little box towards Bruce. There was a moment of hesitation. Then he took it up and untied the tape. They have never been opened, Mr. Smithers said. I kept them for you. Bruce Lowry took off the lid. He knew what he would find, and yet the sight of the well-remembered things lying there hurt him so unbearably that he caught his breath with a little sound of pain. Her engagement ring, a pearl necklace, a small gold locket in which he had worn a miniature of him. When he turned it over with fingers that were not quite steady, he saw it was still there under the glass. How he had altered! Was it true that he had ever looked like that pictured face, so young and free from trouble? A small watch bracelet, a signet ring which he himself had worn, and which she had taken from him one day in fun, and half a dozen other little presents, each one marking some fresh, happy memory of the almost forgotten past. She said she did not know what else to do with them. Mr. Smithers said again, helplessly. Bruce put the little box down on the table between them and replaced the lid. His racing pulses had steadied now, and he felt cold, as if that breath from the past had been an icy one, chilling his new hope and ambition, dooming it to failure. Did she say anything else? He asked with an effort. Mr. Smithers shook his gray head again. No, and I have never seen her since. Bruce looked away from his kindly gaze. I saw her last night, he said. You saw her? Last night? Mr. Smithers was incredulous. Where did you see her? He asked. She was playing in the orchestra of a dancing hall in Soho. There was an eloquent silence. In a dancing hall? Miss Lee? Mr. Smithers could not credit it. Yes, I had no idea she was there, of course. Christopher took me. He's the leader of the orchestra. I went because I had nowhere else to go, and she was there. She knew you. Yes. Mr. Smithers sat down heavily in his big chair. In a dancing hall! Miss Lee? He said again, as if the word sounded the merest nonsense to him. Where are her people, then? Her father? I didn't ask her anything. Mr. Smithers stared at him helplessly. Shall you see her again? He asked. Tonight, I hope. A dozen questions trembled on the old man's lips, but a glance at Bruce Lowry's face prevented him from uttering them. Then, abruptly, Bruce said, How soon can I have some money? I've less than £1 in the world. I can let you have some now to go on with, until your affairs can be settled up. Thank you. Mr. Smithers went to his desk and wrote a check. Then he rang for his clerk. Take that to the bank and cash it, and bring the money to me. He looked at Bruce apologetically. I thought it would be more convenient, perhaps, he said. Bruce laughed. Yes, I'm afraid I haven't a banking account now. When the money was in his possession, he counted it through with trembling fingers. 10, 20, 30, 40 pounds! You can have more if you want, Mr. Smithers said. Bruce hardly heard. His thoughts were rushing ahead to what he could do for Charmian with this money. It was for her he wanted it, to give it to her, to take away the need for her to play in that room with its glaring lights any more, to put her beyond the reach of want forever. He buttoned the notes into his vest pocket, and Mr. Smithers rose. When shall I see you again? He asked. Come any time. Come to dinner with us quietly one night. My wife will be delighted to welcome you. The rogue flushed painfully. I've forgotten how to behave decently, he answered with bitterness. Mr. Smithers gripped his hand. Never mind what you've forgotten. Just come, he said. And that is the end of Chapter 4 of The Romance of a Rogue by Ruby M. Ayres. I hope you return soon to hear the next chapter. Have a great day. Bye!